welcome everybody to this wonderful morning to an event that all of us have been eagerly looking forward to. And a personal thank you to Dr. Anish Pradhan, who's the president of our trust, to have actually introduced us to Professor Greg Booth. This lecture has been organized under the aegis of Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Trust. I trust all of you who are present here are aware of Dr. Ranade, and I don't need to give an elaborate introduction to him, about him. Suffice to say that, in fact, he was a man who was relevant for all times. He's a person who personally stood for encouraging diversity, multiculturalism, pluralism in every aspect of life and the arts. His work and the spectrum of disciplines that he was engaged in meaningfully speaks well for the kind of versatility that his intellect actually had. He was incisive and precise, analytical and informative, witty and thought-provoking, was a master at making the most complex of concepts sound simple and tangible through his lectures and through his papers. Today, artists, scholars, and us audiences desperately miss him. But his legacy lives on through his music, through his books, through his lectures, through his students, and through his associates, and through all of us. So, the Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Trust has been formed with a view to offering support to the kind of work that he himself would have done and encouraged, had death not snatched him away in such an abrupt and untimely manner 9 years ago. So this is the 9th in the series of those lectures, which is a step in that direction. Apart from these lectures, the Trust also has various other initiatives that it has formulated and set in motion. It also invites proposals from all those who, regardless of whether they knew him or studied under him or not, but who do believe that whether in the field of literature, music, theatre, mythology, in any of these fields, if they believe, or any of the arts, if they believe that they would require some support, guidance, a certain framework from the Trust, we are always on the lookout for and welcoming such proposals and encouraging this work, because this is precisely what he would have done had he actually been with us. So this essentially, what we're trying to do is represent and second guess what Dr. Ranade would be doing, and we are trying to take that forward. So today's lecture also is really speaking in a way, apart from the wonderful presentation that you hear from Professor Greg Booth, about whom Dr. Anish Pradhan will be able to tell you more. It's also to be treated as a tribute to an extraordinary scholar and an exceptional human being that Dr. Ranade was.
Namaskar, everyone, and thank you for joining us in the 9th memorial lecture. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, because I can see that people are joining in from various time zones, and this is, I think, a boon from this lockdown. That's possibly the only positive side of this lockdown. So thank you, and I can see practitioners of various arts practices, historians, ethnomusicologists, researchers in various fields, students, musicians joining in to listen to Professor Booth. So thanks once again. I'll do a formal introduction of Professor Gregory Booth, who I have known for several years and was hoping to invite him at some point. I'm sure we will have another occasion to have him physically present at one such lecture. Thank you, Greg, for joining us. So here's his introduction. Gregory D. Booth is Professor of Ethnomusicology at the University of Auckland and has been engaged in the study of Indian music and culture for more than 35 years. He is the author of two books, Behind the Curtain, Making Music in Mumbai's Film Studios, and Brass Baja, Stories from the World of Indian Wedding Bands, as well as numerous articles on the music and film industry and culture in South Asia. He co-edited the 2014 OUP publication, More Than Bollywood, Studies in Indian Popular Music. He is currently studying India's music and film culture industries, focusing on a wide range of factors, including intellectual property, technology, industrial structures, and the music-film relationship. Thank you once again, Greg. Over to Chaitanya to play the recorded version of his lecture.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Namaskar. I would like to say at the outset of this talk how much I appreciate the honor of being invited to participate in this annual commemoration of the life and work of Pandit Ashok Ranade, who was probably the most insightful and innovative Indian music scholar of the 20th century. I also want to express my thanks to Anish Pradhan, who was kind enough to invite me and to organize this entire series of lectures honoring Ranade-saheb. I'm especially happy to be giving this lecture because Ashok Ranade was kind enough to act as my Indian supervisor during my first research project in India in 1984-85. And because he was the first Indian scholar to engage positively with the often troublesome field of ethnomusicology. The term and many understandings of it have proven difficult for many Indian musicians and scholars. Pandit Ravi Shankarji certainly did not approve of having his music included in a field that also studied folk music and other less prestigious forms. Some foreign scholars, myself included, have also struggled with the term and with the superficial and/or essentialist nature of the research undertaken by some ethnomusicologists. Many of us have worked to reverse the early tendency of the field to establish clear distinctions between music genres and traditions, and more broadly, to apply the same understandings and methods to Western music traditions that ethnomusicology has traditionally and historically applied to the rest of the world. Today, I would like to focus on two aspects of ethnomusicology. The first emerging from what I consider to be one of Dr. Ranade's most important contributions to this field, and the second based on what remains a core feature of this field's methodology, one that he only implied in his writing, and that is still sometimes called ethnography. Music studies are an odd field, in that they have historically been undertaken by scholars who assume, without question, the value and the import of a phenomenon that really has neither in any empirical sense. Dr. Ranade recognized this by including ethnomusicology in what he called perspective studies. He argued in 1998 that perspective studies draw attention to the essential multiplicity of music, along with its intrinsic relationship with non-musical aspects of culture. This may not seem like a critical major breakthrough, but in fact, this focus on perspective is the key distinguishing feature of our field. It is the lack of perspective, for example, that causes the School of Music at my university, and at many other universities around the world, to identify themselves as the School of Music, when in fact they should be calling themselves the School of European or Euro-American Music. We could realistically further tighten that definition by specifying Euro-American elite musics, and primarily those from the 18th to 20th centuries. As musicians and as listeners, all of us lack perspective to some extent, although perhaps that lack is generally less than it was. My own perspectives on music in India were shaped by the relatively narrow understanding that my own field of ethnomusicology helped foster. That narrowness was encouraged by some Indian musicians, especially in their conversations with foreigners. The ideologies of India's post-colonial governments, especially in also contributed to a relatively narrow understanding of Indian music, and many non-musical Indians in the U.S. encouraged a similarly myopic focus on the classical traditions, at least in public, allowing foreigners to believe that the classical traditions were the only ones worth attending to. My own musical training was in European and Indian classical worlds. I began my professional musical life as an oboe player and played professionally in orchestras before I started learning tabla. My understandings of music in India therefore emerged from two traditions in which the value of music, of the training, and of the performance of music were all assumed to be much greater than the merely financial. The musicians I encountered, many of them were highly respected figures of national and even international importance. One of the unintended outcomes of my investigations into the world of Indian wedding bands is that it may help to improve our perspective on Indian music culture in general. It has the potential to shape our understandings of the ways that India's changing socio-cultural context has also changed the interactive and interconnected nature of that music culture. It shows how ethnomusicology can expand our understanding of Indian performing traditions in the context of Indian society, and can indeed lead us to what Ranade-saheb called a fuller interpretation of the Indian musical reality. Indian wedding bands have been and remain a widespread and culturally crucial feature of that reality. But their colonial origins have made them a questionable topic of study for some people. Shortly after I began this project in 1988, I met a man in a shop belonging to the Punjab Band on MG Road in Kolkata. When the band's owner introduced me and I had explained that I was writing a book about the wedding band trade, this gentleman questioned the Indianness of my topic. And of course he was correct to argue that the instrumentation of the Indian wedding band has its origins in culture, and particularly the British military culture of the former British Empire. In an ideally ironic twist, however, one that I could not and am not making up, this gentleman suggested that I would be better off studying something more Indian, proposing that I should study the harmonium. Although he had no such intention, the gentleman in this story reinforced a crucial point that I will make today. Music, whether we mean the sounds, or the instruments, or the performers, or the performances, only has meaning when we as humans give it meaning, and that meaning can and does change with context. In the Indian cultural context, brass bands are in fact uniquely Indian. That year that I spent learning about brass bands in 1988 and 89 was the first part of a very long project, in which I had to confront my own ignorance about the subject, the absence of any previous research, and the ignorance of most Indians about a phenomenon almost all had experienced. The difficulties of the project were increased by the disdain that most Indians, musicians and otherwise, had for wedding bands. In the end, the project resulted in a fairly large body of published work and a growing awareness of the importance of non-classical music, and especially filmy, in Indian culture. Wedding bands may seem like an odd place from which to develop what Pundit Ashok Ranade has called a fuller interpretation of the Indian musical reality. And certainly the interpretation that emerges is only one possible interpretation. But part of my larger argument today is that if ethnomusicology teaches us anything, it is that in music, as in other aspects of culture, any step toward what appears to be a relatively discrete musical tradition soon turns into a journey in multiple directions and that embraces multiple interconnected traditions. As we take that journey, our perspective on the musical reality of India becomes wider, both with regard to the music itself and with regard to the people who make it. I begin my consideration of how this works with a short video. It's a clip from the official wedding video made by one of those professional videographers that one sees at weddings everywhere in India. This barat took place less than 12 months ago. which itself is quite a remarkable thing to be even say, given how much our reality has changed since that time. It took place in Rampur in UP. I was attending as a member of the groom's side, for reasons that I will explain later. Most of this audience will recognize the song, either the Kalyanji Ananji original, that was part of the most influential Hindi film soundtrack of 1980, or the remix that was featured in the Sunny Leone item number in the 2008 Rais. I picked this clip because the song was 11 years old by the time of this barat. In the 1980s, bands did sometimes play older songs, but very few, and usually only ones that had come to be associated with weddings and dancing. Even more unusual is that most of the songs that were played last December by the Bharat Shaman Band were older songs. They gave us Hawa Hawaii, they gave us Piya Tu Ab To Aja, and Dil To Pagal Hai, among others. In their own way, the band was reinforcing a complaint that might otherwise be dismissed as nostalgic moaning by those of my generation. Film songs are no good these days. This repertoire was certainly a change from the 1980s and 90s when bands played recent film hits almost exclusively, and when anything more than 6 or 8 months old was categorized by bandsmen as an old song. A band playing a film song is hardly news, although if we follow this particular example down the pathway it opens, we would find ourselves tracing the dominance of Hindi film song in Indian popular culture through to the remix phenomenon and ultimately to film song's at least partial decline in the face of India's ongoing globalization. We would in fact be studying an example of musical, cultural, and one could say technological change. This band's reliance on older songs is also worth commenting on, and if I had the time, I would be tempted to undertake the study to see how widespread the phenomenon is. If bands have indeed reverted to an older repertoire, I would be interested to discover whether more diversity has emerged. I can't help but wonder, for example, how many modern bands are playing Piya Tu Ab To Aja, which is a lovely, lovely song, but not an easy one to play in many ways. We might learn a fair amount about the impact of film song, however, about regional differences, and the extent to which film songs from the era that I call Old Bollywood are indeed becoming or being reinforced as India's folk music. To get a clear answer to those questions, however, I'd need to replicate much of the research I undertook in the 1980s and 90s. Even if we left COVID aside, that's still a daunting project. The groom in this barat was the younger son of my good friend, clarinetist Mohammed Bachchan. He and his sons, Ikram and Imran, operate the Master Abrar Band in Muzaffarpur in Bihar. Bachchan stands in the dual relationships of Shagird and Damad to a mid-century clarinetist named Master Guchan, who was also of Rampur. Although he was a bandmaster by profession, Guchan learned rag and tal from Ustad Mustaq Hussain Khan, who was closely connected to the Rampur Durbar. Bachchan in turn learned some rag and tal and some khayal-based performance practice from Guchan. Performances such as this, and the musicians who could undertake them, had become almost non-existent in India's wedding band world by 1988. This was literally the only such performance I have ever encountered in India, and at that, it was a strategic move by the brothers who owned the Mumtaz Band, for whom Bachchan was working when I filmed this video. Issues of social and cultural identity in post-colonial India, changes in processional social practices, the impact of sound technology, and the overwhelming importance of film song in the post-colonial world enforced a much sharper distinction between classical music and other sectors of Indian music. In late colonial and even early post-colonial India, however, those distinctions had been less clear. Throughout northern India, older bandsmen of the late 1980s could still remember a time when this kind of performance was the norm at Barats. Although based on Khyal-style improvisatory practice and rooted in rag and tal, this kind of performance is classical music performance practice through a glass darkly, so to speak, despite Bachchan's mastery of his instrument. But the performance gives us a different perspective on the place of classical music in the context of processional music in India. It might also give us pause to consider the sustainability of classical music knowledge and understanding in post-colonial or global India. We all need to consider what happened in northern India that made performances like this rarities. In part, we can ask that question from the perspective of what ethnomusicology might call the cultural peripheries. Because if northern India has been the center of the wedding band tradition since its inception, and if the worlds of classical music and wind bands are now well separated in that center, on the peripheries of the world of wind bands, bandsmen were still interacting with the classical world at the end of the 20th century. That was true when I undertook the Pakistani parts of my research in 1995 and 2000, and is still true today if YouTube is to be believed. My research in Pakistan highlighted for me both the unhappy state of Khyal-based classical music in that country, as well as the relatively strong connection between what there was of that musical world and the world of wind bands. Like Bachchan in Rampur, bandmasters in Lahore contextualized themselves through connections to classical musicians and performed the improvisatory alapgat style based on modal constructs that were at least rag-like. Unlike Bachchan, however, they were able to demonstrate connections with living classical families. In some cases, they could successfully invite classical musicians to sit with them in their shops for casual sittings and performances. Furthermore, some bandmasters of the Pakistani Punjab enjoyed a degree of audience appreciation that Indian bandsmen had long since lost. I have not been in Pakistan in 20 years, I'm sorry to say, but again, based on YouTube's evidence, this seems to have been still the case in the first decades of the present century. What struck me most about my experiences in Pakistan was the extent to which musicians took a connection to classical music for granted. I encountered that same matter-of-fact approach, largely by coincidence, in 1989 at the other end of the periphery, so to speak, of the band world in South India. When I returned to undertake a field study of wind bands in India in 1988, one of the unexpected difficulties turned out to be that few Indian academics were interested in being associated with such a project. Although the research was going to be primarily based in northern India, I found myself being affiliated with the University of Madras, as it was then, and Professor S. Sita, who was, I believe, the chair of the music department at that time. Although she had no particular knowledge of the northern wedding band trade, she had an interest in the Indian engagement with foreign, and especially British colonial musical instruments, because of her research on the music of the court of Tanjore. Through contacts she provided, I met and spent some time with the city or corporation band of Chennai. I have written about this group elsewhere, but as you can tell from this excerpt, the group's repertoire included, and in fact was dominated, by South India's tradition of classical devotional compositions. Although the corporation band of the 1980s did play the occasional Hindi film hit, they saw themselves very clearly as being part of a ragam-based processional music history, strongly connected to the Periyamelam tradition that included the great A.K.C. Natarajan and Kaji Gopalnath, among others. The corporation band was largely invisible in the late 1980s. They were playing unpublicized evening performances in parks throughout the city. Sometimes their audience consisted simply of the bats as they came out for their evening meal. Other than their daily attendance taking and sometimes rehearsals at their office in one of the city's parks, their employers paid very little attention to this holdover from an earlier time. There were already positions in the band that had been unfilled for some time in 1989, and more unfilled positions in 1993 when I met the band again very briefly. I have no idea if the group has survived the transformation of the relatively small and quiet metro that was Madras into the much larger, busier, and louder city of Chennai. One of the benefits of studying music culture in perspective, as Ranade-saheb would have described it, is that we almost always come face to face with two realities. The first is that music's meaning and value are almost entirely context dependent, even when that music comes with lyric. If we were to magically abstract the performance of clarinetist B. Krishnamurti, who was featured in this last video, and change the performance setting to a local mandir, have him sit down and wear a kurta and dhoti instead of his band uniform, the meaning of his performance would also be altered. It would still be a Tyagaraja Kriti, but that verbally constructed and indexically reinforced devotional meaning would be further reinforced by the new setting. We might even think differently of Krishnamurti himself, at least as regards his socio-musical status and identity. Bachchan's and Krishnamurti's performances, with their obvious connections that extend from the world of Indian wind bands to the classical world, suggest, if nothing else, that we need to see classical music in a more nuanced way and understand how that music has at times been part of a much larger musical world that contained more fluid, if not fewer, distinctions between wind bands and Indian classical music. The second reality we face is an outcome of the first. As context changes, so do the meaning and value of music, even if the music itself appears to remain the same. When the musical ancestors of these South Indian bandsmen first picked up European musical instruments in the vicinity of the Tanjore court in the latter 19th century, they were being daringly innovative with commercial intent. If we magically shifted the entire performance on my video back to 1950, around the time that the band was established in its corporate role, we would confront a particular version of Indian post-colonial modernity, a negotiation that presented the materials of South India's classical tradition in a new civic form, and that pointed towards a new global, if not westernized, version of Indian culture for the future of independent India. 40 years after that, when I filmed them, neither the instruments nor the repertoire had changed substantially. But the performances of the Madras Corporation Band were, by that point, somewhat shabby signs of the political and cultural past. a past that was being neglectfully maintained by the Madras Corporation, with little concern for the status of the musicians or the impact of their music. Maintenance and preservation, especially in the realm of music, almost inevitably run afoul of changing contexts. There has never been a period in any form of the past in which musical sounds and meanings were stable. The two performances that I have shared today were the exceptions during the research that I undertook from the late 1980s through the latter 1990s. Then as now, most Indian wedding bands play filmy, most or all of the time. In 1989, even the Madras Corporation Band was playing Ek Do Teen, although that was their only concession to the dominance of a doubly foreign repertoire. As far as I know, it is only in Pakistan that bands still routinely perform in a style that acknowledges the classical performance practice I heard in Varanasi in 1988. If we want explanations for these matters, and for the regional as well as the temporal variability that we have been confronting here, we have to rely on ethnography. Ethnography is perhaps ethnomusicology's central and most important methodology. At the same time, it has often been an ill-defined practice, explanations of which have frequently been overcomplicated and over-theorized. Among other things, the ways in which ethnography may work and the kinds of information that it can access vary substantially depending on the setting. I have no real interest in going back into the history of ethnography as practice in anthropology or ethnomusicology. I will only note that much of the problem came, and still comes, from attempts to align the comments, words, and stories that researchers collect with theories that may or may not have much to do with the ideas of the people from whom those comments were collected. I will talk shortly about some of the questions and issues that came out of my research in the band world, but first I need to briefly pursue this potential for misalignment in research, especially when that research is across cultures. As strange as it may be to say, ethnographic research can be very like tourism. Both often involve inherent social and economic power imbalances between two groups of cultures. Both are frequently enabled by particular kinds of ignorance on the part of one or both groups. I'd also say that in both tourism and research, both parties tend to be at least partly dissatisfied with the outcomes. In academic research, much of the inherent imbalance emerged from the construction of the modern university within the colonial world, and through the subsequent alignment of research goals and methods with the colonial world's desire to understand and control the colonized. With the rise of American hegemony in the late 1940s, all of that was scientifically framed in the context of neocolonialism. The idea of ethnographic research as social science and research as pursuit of a scientific higher truth were parts of this construct and had a formative influence on fields such as ethnomusicology. To my mind, the understanding of ethnography as science only confused people's approaches to what was really more a matter of interpreting meaning than of reporting empirical data. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, where a great deal of research focuses on the cultures of the Pacific, researchers are beginning to replace the term ethnography with the Tongan Samoan term talanoa, which basically just means conversation. Certainly, a great deal of my ethnographic research in the world of wedding bands was just that. That is part of the reason the title of my brass band book proposes to tell stories rather than to relate scientific data. Ethnographers attempt to explain what things mean, which is all that really matters in studies of culture. The goal is to relate what people say about the meaning of whatever one is studying, and to help readers understand what they say. The difficulty is doing that without imposing one's own set of meaning on the thing. I'll offer an example shortly. I've already suggested that the meanings of European-style wind bands changed over time in India. By the time I was undertaking my research, Indian wedding bands were carrying the multifaceted burden of both colonial and filmy associations, along with the older and often negative implications of the processional music trade. Brass bands had been pushed to the very furthest borders of Indian constructions of its own music culture, where musicianship and aesthetic concerns were not merely variable, but not expected. The impact of these burdens on the lives of bandsmen was only made clear to me once I began the ethnographic process of trying to make sense of the musical and social chaos of the North Indian Barat. I mentioned earlier that one of the problems I encountered in this project is that I was working in a vacuum. Hardly anyone knew anything about North Indian wedding bands, except the bandsmen themselves. The few exceptions had regionally specific memories or knowledge about a small group of bands in a particular city or region. Bandsmen, many of whom were migrant workers, had similarly limited knowledge of their trade outside the cities in which they worked. However beneficial ethnography was, it wasn't able to provide any sense of the potential or meaning of any regional variation in the trade until I had visited enough cities and regions to make that judgment. Further, I needed to do enough work in different regions to assess whether the history of wedding bands in UP, for example, was similar to or connected to that of Maharashtra, and so on. As a result, what I initially conceived of as a year's project turned into a cumulative and approximately 3 years of research in India and Pakistan, and took 15 years from the beginning of the first trip to publication of the book. Over that time, I ended up covering a relatively wide area of India and the Pakistani Punjab. Part of the problem with ethnography as a method is that there is never enough. One can always seek to learn more about whatever it is and can end up never actually writing the book that was the original goal. When I found that most of the stories I was hearing were familiar, or that I knew more about what was going on than most of the men I was talking to, I decided it was time to put an end to what is nevertheless an endless process. As it turned out, I wrote most of the book in Lahore. Much of what I have been calling research was sitting around in band shops. It was indeed conversation, much of it uncontrolled and often undirected. I asked questions, but so did the men I was talking to. They were as interested in finding out about my life as I was in finding out about theirs. Although they didn't think of it in these terms, ethnography was for them a reciprocal process. I also spent a great deal of time following along at barats or processions, shooting very bad video, usually walking backwards. Among other things, this research made clear just how difficult and frequently unmusical the lives of these musicians were. As I mentioned, making sense of meaning, especially in a culture other than one's own, is a fraught process. Foreign-made theories of Indian culture and music often demonstrate the level of peril involved. And, of course, no area of Indian culture is as fraught as that having to do with community and caste, concepts that have fascinated foreign scholarship on India for decades. The social dynamics of the band business were, and still are, lived by everyone who goes to a wedding or works in the trade. But different perspectives offer different understandings of those dynamics. Across the country, the identities of bandsmen vary, although in some regions or some cities, communal engagement in the band business can be quite narrowly focused. My research in the 1990s suggested that the majority of band owners and bandsmen in any given city or region belong to communities that could be considered minorities and or outsiders in that region or city. In quite a few cases, the band business has been one for incomers, sometimes for refugees. Where the matter of caste or communal identity becomes more contentious is when we try to interpret the meaning of these relatively empirical results. We could be entirely pragmatic and say that the band business is one that a family gets into either through traditional connections with processional music or because they have no better options for making a living. If we look for a theory to help us interpret some of this clearly economic behavior, however, we run full speed into issues of jajmani, dan, kamins, and other such things. Here is where the process of ethnography has the potential to betray the very people and culture it seeks to explain. Barat participants, at least when talking to foreigners such as myself, do not use theoretical terms like jajmani or dan to describe the behaviors in this video. They tend to talk about tips rather than dan, money given as a sign of happiness. Bandsmen sometimes say tips as well, but many also refer to customers who give these tips as danidar. The trouble with the pursuit of meaning in symbolic or expressive culture is that meanings change with context. Regardless of who is doing the research and however they approach it, ethnography has to acknowledge and respond to ambiguity and to change. In 1988, I bought the Mumtaz Band their first microphone. The day after I received it and passed it on, they had it wired to their sound card, and almost overnight, the Mumtaz brass players became the backup band for the vocals provided by Mumtaz Master's son, and the amplified solos of the leading bandmasters. Many bands in bigger cities already had sound cards by 1988. By the mid-1990s, any self-respecting band had one. The presence of amplified solo voices has changed the demands on brass players and on bandmasters, and has created the potential to reduce the overall size of the party while retaining a family's ability to dominate a neighborhood sonically. I've not seen or been to a barat in India without a sound card since sometime in the later 1990s. I stopped going to barats as regular practice for research around 2000. I've been to a few since then, occasionally with bandsman friends, and sometimes as a participant. Well before 2000, processions in the Indian metros had become or were becoming impossible. Kolkata prohibited private wedding and devotional processions in the mid-1990s. Mumbai, as most of you probably know, has long focused on the Machligar option for barats, although there are still occasionally barats in some neighborhoods. Delhi is also largely impossible for processions, except for some smaller gullies and inside specific colonies. The explosion of private vehicles across India has made the traditional barat more difficult just about everywhere. India may still be home to the world's largest processional music trade, but the difficulties, if not impossibilities, of the modern-day barat are reducing demand. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the last barat I attended took place 2 weeks short of a year ago today in Rampur. 3 months after that event, India and much of the rest of the world went into various forms of lockdown because of COVID-19. We are all still dealing with the ongoing effects of that virus. But COVID put a virtual, if potentially temporary, end to barats and continues to limit their size, duration, or location. COVID is probably accelerating a process of decline that was already underway in the wedding band trade. I have already mentioned the difficulties of taking out a barat in many contemporary urban spaces. What is more, marriage practices and customs in India were changing even before COVID appeared on the scene. While we all still enjoy a good party, the need to enact that party on the streets and the symbolism behind that enactment may be less powerful than they were. In the end, because the demand for a wedding band is social rather than musical, it is hard to imagine a post-COVID reality in which things go back to a pre-COVID norm. For many bandsmen, COVID had another immediate effect that resulted from the sudden lockdown imposed by the government. Bandsmen are migrant workers, as I've mentioned. I can have no idea of how many of them were suddenly stranded along with other migrant workers across India when lockdown occurred. I assume the number was very large. Long-term change aside, band owners are already competing for the fewer barats that will occur in the 2021 season. There will be fewer bands and fewer bandsmen when and if COVID has faded into the background. My experience of COVID in India has largely come through the family of Mohammed Bachchan, whose solo clarinet we heard earlier in this lecture. In one version of a story that has been widely reported in the Indian press, Bachchan's elder son Ikram was trapped in Muzaffarpur in Bihar when lockdown struck. Rampur has been famous in UP as a source of migrant bandsmen, but following his ustad's lead, Bachchan took the practice a step further, establishing his own band shop in a city that traditionally had a higher demand for his services, despite being roughly 900 kilometers from the family home in Rampur. Ikram was on his own in Muzaffarpur, looking after the shop and taking bookings when lockdown was imposed. He spent a month or so living in his room in a rented house, living largely through the kindness of friends until he finally walked the 40 kilometers or so up to one of the national highways and found a lorry that was headed west. He has returned again to Muzaffarpur since then, now hoping for bookings for the upcoming season. But things are not looking very promising. We have been talking about finding a way out of the band trade, but for this family, as for many, the options are relatively few. This is the final point I want to make today. Lofty conceptualizations of research as the abstract pursuit of a scientific, higher knowledge have sometimes allowed scholars to pursue that research without thinking much about the people who were providing them with information, or whose photographs they were taking, or whose music they were studying. This has varied from researcher to researcher, but it took quite a while for the field as a whole to begin asking questions about the human side of the ethnographic project. Most researchers hope to gain materially from their research, but what do the objects of that research gain? These questions have been exacerbated by the economic and power discrepancies that are built into relationships between researchers and the researched. In the world of Indian classical music, the power dynamics that have been attendant upon ethnomusicological research have been sometimes altered and I suspect always camouflaged by the cultural conventions of the classical music world. The logic of the Guru Shishya Parampara, the Guru's knowledge and lineage, the relatively wide range of international contexts that many Indian classical musicians have acquired, and a Guru's often real power and ability to decide whether to teach, when to teach, and who to teach, all had the potential to alter the balance of power in their favor and to outweigh the logic of Western academic research. To be sure, the relative material wealth of the Western university infrastructure pushed things back in favor of Western academics in many cases, but that wealth was at least institutional rather than personal. During my research in the classical world of tabla, it was clear that I was dependent on the goodwill of the ustads who I hoped to interview, and who enjoyed considerable prestige and authority. They understood the process of research in broad terms, and some had already well-established networks in the West. They also understood that I was a student at that time. As a rule, their ability to help me was greater than mine to help them. Almost no one discussed money or asked to be paid for the privilege of speaking with them. The power dynamics that I encountered in the world of wedding bands were entirely different. Bandsmen had very little understanding of what it meant to be writing a book, or what the benefits of such a project might be. Most had had no experience with foreigners and spoke no English. I was the only foreigner most of them knew, and unlike their classical colleagues, they had very little basis on which to assess the possible benefits of helping me, or the perils of not. On some level, bandsmen perceived the inherent wealth that allowed me to spend my time wandering around India sitting in band shops and asking silly questions, which is how they experienced my presence. I clearly had the power of mobility. I came and went from their lives as I wished. I could always choose to return and visit them again, but they had no comparable access to me. Once I left their city, let alone India, their even contacting me meant relying on the post. Having said that, bandsmen were as hospitable as they could be. I traveled with them, participated in social and professional events, drank endless cups of tea, and enjoyed snacks and meals all over the country and in Pakistan. I sat in their shops, visited some of them at home, and in the end, benefited significantly from the information that they shared. From the beginning, the question for me was how to repay their many kindnesses. If the process of ethnography is a reciprocal one, then both parties must in some way benefit from that process, at least if they wish to do so. But the mechanics of that kind of reciprocity are culturally, socially, and materially complicated, to put it mildly. Unlike their classical colleagues, bandsmen didn't hesitate to talk about money, ask about money, and also ask for things that they thought I could get for them. Microphones and echo boxes topped the list in those years, but electronic keyboards, instruments, mouthpieces, and reeds were also desired items. These were not conditional requests as such. I'm sure many of them asked without much expectation that I would actually come up with anything. They had no real idea of the challenges or the finances involved in getting things from overseas. I provided microphones and so on to the best of my ability, but as time went on, the number of my acquaintances and friends in the band world continued to grow, and the requests with them. Over time, I have worked out other solutions to this problem. But regardless of the solutions, the point I wish to conclude with is that ethnography is a human process, one that inevitably entails mutual obligations. I felt when I undertook this work, and I continue to feel now, that the power imbalance that enables ethnography also obliges ethnographers to do what they can to share the benefits of their privileged positions, the maintenance of which is partly the result of contributions by those on the short ends of those power imbalances. Thank you.
I've already been getting a lot of questions. So first of all, there are questions related to the musical aspect, and then there are questions related to the business part of this world. So I'll start with the musical. You did mention, for instance, a musician who learned from Ustad Mushtaq Hussain Khasab of Seswan Rampur. But in general, do these bandsmen have formal training? And if so, in what kind of music? And how much of that training is through a particular instrument, or is it done vocally? So these are some of the questions related to the training part.
Mostly not. Mostly, as we all understand, bandsmen, especially in India, are learning from other bandsmen. They're learning from other bandmasters enough to play the melodies they need to play. I don't know, and we'll never know at this point, how much of that was the case 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even in 1947, say. One occasionally met musicians who claimed relationships with ustads. There was a man in Varanasi who claimed a relationship with Ustad Alauddin Khasab of Maihar. That was a very instrumental thing. He actually claimed to have been playing in the Maihar band. I'm not entirely convinced, but it certainly was a claim that he made. I encountered somebody in Baja a family that claimed a relationship with Ustad Amir Khansab.
Oh.
And there was, you walked into the shop and his photograph was there on the wall, and you saw that occasionally, but you don't see it much. And as I say, it's not clear to me whether there was more of that in the past or not. That practice is a practice that older men, especially in UP, said used to be the norm, that people played the sort of alap gut style in processional context. I've heard about that happening in Rajasthan, Punjab. And in fact, now that I think about it, there was a guy who appeared at the Barsi, a long time ago now, maybe 10 years ago now, Ustad Allah Rakha Khan Sahib's Barsi, from Rajasthan, from Jaipur, who himself claimed a relationship with Ali Akbar Khan Sahib. So you saw it, but it's not, as I say, it's not a common thing. It may have been more common. It's not entirely clear, but it's certainly not common now.
And would you say that even if it was in terms of a lineage going back to the classical tradition, would you say that the music did not necessarily betray these connections?
Well, again, I think there was a point when it did, and you can still hear it. You can still hear this kind of performance practice in Lahore and places on that side.
All right.
But you don't hear it in India, as I mentioned. But I'm not sure, frankly, Anish, that lineage may be too strong a word. I mean, it may be more almost coincidental kinds of relationships. Somebody happens to be there. Somebody happens to know somebody who knows somebody. There's some sort of other connection that brings about that relationship.
Right. And at any point, do you see bandsmen making an attempt to have this kind of upward social mobility by moving from one instrument to another, or moving from their own form of music to another form of music? For instance, in the case of clarinet, we see a fair number of clarinet players. I mean, even in Begum Akhtar, some of Begum Akhtar's recordings.
Oh yeah, Mahmood Hasab.
Yes. So, so I'm not too sure about the connection with bands, but do you find that some bandsmen try to move away from playing in wedding bands and moving to, let's say, classical music?
They certainly were in the 80s to some extent. I mean, you could see it in some places, and as you say, it mostly was the clarinet, which is, I mean, the most suitable instrument, one can say, for that kind of thing. I mean, there's a gentleman, I don't think he's probably still there, in Pune,
Yes.
Bandhupan Sholapurkar.
Sholapurkar, yes.
Yeah. And his family was a band family. And I think was also a Prabhat band, as I recall. But he didn't play in the Bharat. He was sitting down and playing classical programs and making that tradition and claiming, I believe, he was claiming a relationship with Ustad Bismillah Khan Sahib.
Right.
So he was making a very strong effort to move in that direction.
Yes. So sorry. Would you say that some of the wind players were originally also Shehnai players, or even Sundari players?
It's to the best of my knowledge, in the North, pretty much not. Or if it was so long ago that nobody knows about it anymore. I mean, the bands in the north, the wedding bands, have been going for quite some time, very early in the 20th century at least. And nobody's memory really works that well. They were more like, I mean, I think Sundari is more likely than Shehnai. You find it in some places. You find it in Karnataka, around the Mane Jadav's people, who are very well known and very dominant in that area, and they came out of Shehnai backgrounds and out of backgrounds connected to still light music, but more like theater music. Nautanki, that kind of thing. Not Nautanki, but sort of theatrical light music, not precisely folk music, but certainly not classical music, somewhere in the middle there.
Mm. You do mention that folk melodies and earlier wedding songs perhaps played a part in the repertoire of wedding bands, but not so as much now. Do you feel that when there are Muslim wedding bands, the wedding songs are primarily from those which were sung in Muslim families, and likewise for Hindu? Is there any such?
No, it's no. There's probably I mean, first of all, of course, there are more Hindu families than Muslim families anyway, right? I mean, just sheer numbers. Secondly, there is a proportion of Muslim families who are not going to take out, or are going to take out a barat without a band. They're going to do it the Sharia way.
Mm.
Not all of them by any means. It's not consistent, but some proportion. So they're already a smaller proportion of the total market, if I can speak about it like that, than the Hindu families. So by and large, that's going to be the focus regardless of who the bandsmen are. And quite frankly, you occasionally you used to see it in films, and I can't think of the film off the top of my head, but very old British songs that would be played by the bands. And most of those guys in UP could still play some marches, British marches, or Indian composed marches, but very few, because that's, again, not what the demand is. The demand is for dancing. Mm-hmm. Certainly now, whoever's left, they're playing for dancing. And that pretty much means filmy. The exceptions are older film songs that are specific to weddings. And occasionally, I couldn't fit it in. I had a video I was going to show of, did we get Prabhat? A band from Hyderabad playing for a religious event at the Manik Prabhu?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. In Ahmedabad, right?
No, it's south, I think, closer to Karnataka.
Yeah, Ahmedabad.
Ahmedabad.
Yeah, Ahmedabad, yeah. And they played, and for that event, they played like, let me think, Yashoda Kimeya, from Satyam Shivam Sundaram, and O Vasanti, that very old. So they were playing songs that they were trying to line up with the nature of the event a little bit. But that's really about as far as it goes.
Greg, is there a hierarchy among the bandsmen? I mean, obviously there must be between the bandmaster and the others in the ensemble. And I suppose that he is not only the owner of the band, but also the sort of a musical director. But within the ensemble itself, is there a hierarchy, particularly if a vocalist joins? Is there some sort of hierarchy between the vocalist and the backing instrumental?
Not too much, really. Bandmaster doesn't necessarily mean you're a malik. It doesn't necessarily mean you're the guy who owns the shop. Bandmaster refers to really musical expertise. Okay, so in that first example I played, or the second example I played, of that performance in Varanasi from '88, Bachchan is there as a bandmaster, but he was working as a migrant laborer at the same time. So he was a migrant laborer bandmaster.
Right.
He's since now he's running. Now he's a malik. Now he's the dukandar in Muzaffarpur, but at that time he was just playing, as working for somebody else, basically.
Right. And my last question before I take questions from the audience is related to the business aspect. So in your book, you reproduce a form which the Abrar band, I think, has.
That's Bachchan's.
Yes. And if you could just talk about what clauses are there in that form, and then also because I think it's a fantastic study of how they have professionalized their working, and at the same time, do you think that the professional arrangement has reached out to also, let's say, the band owners providing for insurance for the bandsmen, or for supporting upkeep of their instruments, and what happens about let's say this is really far out, but with IPRS following up on copyright and collecting money for the performance of copyrighted material. What happens? I mean, this is all copyrighted material, right?
That's not happening.
So do the patrons and the bandsmen ever look out for
no. You're off in no. That's no. Nobody's talking about copyright. It's just simply not part of the. Doesn't. I don't even think. I suspect 90% of the guys in the business don't even know about that.
Do they do original work?
No.
No.
They're playing for an audience, and the audience want to hear what they want to hear, and what they want to hear is the songs they know that they can dance to.
Right. Could you just tell them about the Abrar form?
Okay. What I have to do, actually, if I see if I can, I don't even know if I have the book here. Hang on. I can't. The form. We're talking some number of days ago, sir.
I thought it was really fascinating, the number of things that they had put down there.
Well, they put down as much as they can. Let me say it like that, right? So first of all, the instruments that you mentioned, instruments belong to the malik. They don't belong to the musicians.
Right.
Right. So most of the instruments, all the brass that you see in those videos, they belong to the band. They don't belong to the musicians who are playing them.
Right.
Right. There's a couple. Somebody like Bachchan's going to have his own clarinet, but by and large, they don't own instruments.
You're right.
And there's certainly no insurance, or that's New India, right? This is old India, pretty much.
We're still in old India, Greg, and in fact, we are going into older India.
Well, that may be. That's yet another story.
Always than one.
Yeah. But yeah.
I couldn't help myself, but
yeah, no, I know. But so they and again, those forms are very. They use them, but basically, a lot of the times they're not going to fill out all that detail. They're going to negotiate a fee, and pretty much the fee is what it's going to be. The form exists for the show. I mean, it's they're making show.
Yes. But even so, I think a lot of classical musicians who would otherwise think that they are very educated and literate and etc., they don't enter into such contracts. But here are people who are saying that, what's the date of assignment? Where is the procession going to start from? Where is it going to end? Uh,
Yep.
all those
Well, but
things.
you do have to know that stuff. I mean, that stuff,
Yeah.
and that has to be agreed before you can really fix a fee. Because if they're where are we? We're in Mumbai. You know, if somebody goes down to Bhendi Bazaar and wants to hire a band, one of the old guys, but the event is way up in, you know, Boriwali or someplace, that has to be taken into account. They're going to have to hire a lorry to get everybody up there and down there. So they have to know that
Right.
to deal with the fees. And that kind of stuff is part of it. How long, I mean, none of it ever comes true, in effect.
Yes.
That I was going to put this again, I was trying to keep the time down. The slide I was showing there in the background for all of that tower PowerPoint was a small bunch of guys, somebody I think was Mansoor or somebody like that, who were sitting around one night in Varanasi. And one of the things you do in the band world is you sit around a lot and wait on the side of the road, drinking tea, waiting for the Bharat to get its act together. And, you know, whatever the time is that it's fixed, you know it's not going to be that time. The band shows up, and then everybody sits around and drinks tea and smokes cigarettes and just waits. And it's an hour, it's 2 hours, it's whatever it turns out to be. So even when they fill those forms out, it's purely, it's an entirely hypothetical situation.
Mm. Okay, so I'm going to take questions from the audience now. What major shifts in the political economy of marriage more broadly have you seen in your years of research? And how has this impacted the business of brass bands? That is, tell us a bit more about marriage itself and those that hire bands. This is a question from Sudev Sheth, who teaches at Harvard. History.
Okay.
He teaches history.
Well, okay, this is entirely just my random observation. So there's nothing, you know, I don't study marriage. But just generally speaking, I mean, we all know, I mean, especially in the metros, the idea of the whole fixed marriage thing that used to be the norm, it's not really part of culture in a lot of places now in India, right? I mean, we all understand this. And even when it is, people tend to focus increasingly more on the receptions, more on the sort of partying inside rather than partying outside, even when it's possible to party outside. That whole thing has changed to some extent. And as I say, I don't study marriage, so I can't speak with any kind of authority on the extent of that change, but it's certainly evident to me just wandering around in general. It's the best answer I got for you. Sorry about that, sir.
Right. Here's another question. Is it possible to kindly elaborate on influx and choices of brass instruments that the musicians made? How were the decisions made? How much Western influence decided the choices? How was availability ensured? This is from Soham Mandal.
Okay. Well, the entire ensemble, the entire nature of the unit is coming out of the British construction, right? It's coming out of the British Army versions of that. And there was some variety in there if you go back to the 19th century. But by and large, whatever was happening in the military is what's happening in the wedding band world. Now, that does change slightly over time, but by and large, after 1930-ish, it's pretty consistent. The only real change has been the change from in the brass bass, as we say. I'm trying to think. you had in that first video you had with Bada Chaman, you saw those sort of the brass bases that the guy wears around him, and then the horn faces front. Okay, that's an American construction, and that's a relatively late innovation. If you go to Pakistan, you still see the old sort of brass bases where the bell sort of sticks out over your shoulder. But other than that, it's simply a question of what the British were playing in 1930, let's say. Let's pick a year at random, more or less. Now, in terms of availability, the availability has traditionally, so to speak, come from Meerut, from Nadir Ali, who were the big manufacturers of not British, but of brass musical instruments in India. And they were the first and almost the only for quite some time. Big factory there. I don't know how they're doing these days. I think they're still in business. And there were a number of, as you often do, find smaller factories around them producing brass instruments, and they were building it all by hand. They were building everything. They were selling bagpipes. They were selling all the brass. They were selling clarinets. And still, bandsmen went up to Meerut to order instruments, and that's how that whole thing worked out. But it's been pretty consistent since that time. It hasn't changed much until, of course, you get to the amplification business, and then things do change.
Right. Here's another question. I wanted to ask about the kind of ironic use of brass band music in new age Hindi Bollywood music, Dev D, for example, and whether you might be able to comment on this in relation to the slow retreat of actual bands. This is from Matangi Krish.
I'm trying to remember the scene that she's referring to, but and I can't, but that's okay. It's kind of ironic. It's kind of nostalgic. It's kind of the old-fashioned thing. I mean, in a way, it kind of lines up with what I think of as the UP movies that you see from time to time these days, right? The movies that present this sort of fictionalized, exoticized vision of UP, the sort of small town UP. I mean, it's what's it one with Salman Khan, the Bong series, right? Yeah. And those towns that are just so colorfully, whatever they are. It's part of that construction. It's, in my mind, what I would say about this kind of thing is we all see it, and even in the smaller cities in India, we see the world changing and the speed of that change really ramping up, and everybody moving out of the end of the pre-liberalization, early liberalization time into this modern globalized world, and everybody's on the internet. And I think there is a level of nostalgia that attaches to all this kind of stuff, and I think probably the brass bands are part of that for some people. As I say, I can't remember the particular scene that's being referred to, but
Emotional Atyachar is the song.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah, okay. Sorry. Now I remember. Okay, good. Yeah, but that is absolutely nostalgia. It's that we want to go back to this, or not necessarily go back to, but that's nostalgia, right? Longing for stuff that's gone,
right?
And that's kind of what we're talking about here. And I would certainly say that emotional Atyachar is very much that.
Right. I think we've got time for a couple more. This is from Siddharth Padyar, who's a student of tabla. I wish to know, like Hindustani music world has a class of hereditary musicians and a class of first-rate musicians, has brass band culture also seen such an evolution? And if it did, how different were those from the traditional band setup?
And by traditional band setup, we maybe mean what?
I think he means Shehnai and
Acha, okay.
yeah.
Well, the fact of the matter is nobody wants to be in the brass band business. Okay, let's just be clear about it. Nobody wants to be in the business. You're in the business because that's the option. You haven't got the financial capital or the social capital or the education to get out. And there are families that, you know, go back quite a number of generations in the sort of processional music business. But if they can find a way out, they're going to find a way out. I mean, this is a conversation I have not every day, but I have it once a week, certainly, with Bachchan's boy, Ikram, you know, and we're constantly trying to figure out a way to get out of the business, because there's no, I mean, aside from the fact that business is terrible, even before COVID, it's not a profession somebody wants to be in, really.
Mm-hmm.
And you see it in families I've seen it in families all over India. They started out, they make sure their sons go to English medium schools, they get into a different line, they step back from the performing, and that's really the goal. That's the first goal, is you step back from performing and just be a manager. And the second goal is you make sure your kids can do something else. And then you just either shut the shop or you hire a manager to run it. But so there's no motivation in this to you know, wish for your sons to carry on in the line. It's actually almost the opposite. It is absolutely the opposite.
Right. The last question from Amy Catlin, very well known ethnomusicologist. Thank you for the fascinating research and lecture. Do you maintain any communication via Facebook with some musicians to whom you became closer? Did any singing boys continue to sing after adolescence and change of voice?
Yes to both questions. I'm very close to Bachchan's family, and I was at that wedding that I showed the first barat. I was part of that whole thing, and I support them in a lot of ways when I can. Some of them, it's very odd. There are a lot of the female singing. Well, how do I say this? A lot of the female voices in, like that first example. Go back to that first example, Lelo Lela, right? That's a man singing. That's an adult male singing. That's not a boy. So there are guys who specialize in that very high pitch, doing the female parts. You know, whether it's the same guys. I don't remember what Chund is doing. That's that little boy in that picture. I don't know if he's still singing or not. I can't remember, to be honest with you. But sometimes yes and sometimes no is the short answer to that question.
All right. Thanks very much, Greg. I'll hand it over to Chaitanya.
On behalf of Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Trust, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to Dr. Gregory Booth for gracing the 9th Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Lecture and delivering such an enlightening lecture on this online platform, besides the odds we all are facing in this pandemic situation. And I especially thank Dr. Booth as his insightful presentation was an add tribute to Dr. Ranade and the path of Indian ethnomusicology that he envisaged. I also thank Dr. Anish Pradhan for curating this lecture and Mr. John for providing the technical support and making this lecture possible on this virtual format. I also thank all viewers for participating in this event and making it lively. lastly, I hope we all will meet next year for the 10th Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Lecture in a lively or vibrant, healthy environment in actual live interactions.